Music, anime, a book, a textbook, a dictionary, or a YouTube video. Every piece of content that contains Japanese can be used to learn from and thus can be a resource. So they're actually all good resources and I use all of them, but you have to know when to use which ones efficiently. Because a book is way too complicated to start reading when you only know a couple of words, and a YouTube video in Japanese is way too hard to understand when you don't know any grammar yet. It's about how you use them and when to use them. So the way I see it, you can divide resources for grammar and vocabulary in two categories: active grammar input, passive grammar input, vocabulary active input, and vocabulary passive input. So first of all, actively studying grammar, which is the most simple way of learning any language. This, or learning any language in general, is only efficient when you consider these three things. First, it should be fun, not boring. It should be easy to understand, not too complicated to understand, and then it should be relevant, not irrelevant. So I think a resource that meets each of these three conditions works really well. And whether it works for you depends on your definition of the condition. For example, something can be fun for me, like grammar, but boring for somebody else. And something can be easy to understand for me, but hard to understand for somebody else. And something can be totally relevant to me, but not relevant to somebody else. Now let's talk about each of these three things. In my opinion, I think textbooks are generally boring and I don't really like them. On the other hand, they could be easy to understand, but that depends on the author and how they write things. And then in terms of relevancy, I think at the start it is totally relevant, because at first you have to know greetings, introductions, family members, counting, all these things that are all relevant because you need to learn them. But as you get better in the language, the topics become more random and maybe they become more irrelevant. Because the thing is, at the start you don't really have another choice than to pick up a book and to just start learning. And even though it's boring, you have to stay consistent, and that is the most important part, being consistent with this. So like I said, even though I think it can be quite boring, if you combine this with the right inputs, like the passive input, then I think this is a great combination and you can learn a lot by just doing this. The resource that I'm talking about is this textbook, Japanese from Zero. I think the first book of this series is the top seller on Amazon for Japanese textbooks. But what I unintentionally did in order to make up for the boring stuff in the textbook is watch the videos that are free to find on YouTube. That makes learning with this resource way more fun, easier to understand and relevant, as long as you watch the content that matches your level. I seriously can't recommend this series/book enough. I made a video about that series too, so you can watch that if you want. There'll be a link in the description. As for passive grammar, the way I see it is that once you reach a certain point of doing active grammar lessons, most of the time, you can now gradually switch to doing more passive grammar study, which is mostly listening. The most important factor here is that you find something at your level. I recommend YouTube for this too. Just make sure you watch videos aimed at beginners, if you're a beginner, or intermediate learners, if you are intermediate. Then there's a podcast, Japanese Konteppei, I think. It feels really good when you understand this. I think it's somewhere between beginner and intermediate level. Finally, I recommend any YouTube video where there's a lot of conversation, as you will encounter a lot of grammar basically anywhere. And here's a tip: find content about your hobbies but type it in Japanese. I did that and I found this channel that I regularly watch and enjoy. Don't focus too much on understanding everything, because you won't, especially with Japanese, that can be really difficult. So in my case, I just want to understand basically everything that I read or that I listen to. And I noticed that I focus way more on input than output. I don't speak or write at all. I just focus on understanding, and I think that is really a fun thing to do. So I think if you're like me and you really like to understand something, then it's important that you learn something first and then try to encounter it as many times as possible, because that is when you actually remember it. Because here's how that works. When you get exposed to something in Japanese, the only way for you to remember it is if you have learned it before by actively studying the grammar or through context, like visual context. For example, if I start counting to 10, then the only way for you to understand this is if you have previously learned how to count to 10, because then you'll remember it and you'll say, oh, I know what he's doing, he's counting to 10. Or if I do this as I'm counting to 10, you also know that what I'm doing is counting to 10, because you have context, you have visual context, in this case me using my hands. And so every time when you learn something new actively and then you hear it through exposure, your brain can make that connection. And every time that you can make such a connection is when you learn something. And that's why you need to expose yourself as much as possible to native content, because the more you expose yourself, the more chances you have that you will make these connections when you encounter something that you've learned before. Reading is by far the best way to learn vocabulary. Not only because a book contains thousands of words, but the most important part is that the words are all in context. Usually usually a story, because you are more likely to figure out the meaning of a word when you understand the story that you're reading. So in order to make sure that you understand most of what you're reading, there's a certain category of books that have been written for people that are learning a language. And they're called graded readers, like this one for example. This one is for Japanese. So they're written in a way that you're probably going to understand 98% of it. And let's say you have 10 words or one sentence, and every time you have to look up one word in every sentence. That just takes so much time, and especially with Japanese, it takes so much time to look up stuff, to look up kanji that you don't know. So if you can read and understand at least 98% of what you're reading, then you can read very comfortably and also learn a lot of vocab without having to look up too many words. However, reading in Japanese is already a pain, and that's because every damn sentence has a kanji that you don't know. And even if you do know the meaning of the kanji, there might be a few ways to read the kanji. Kanji provide meaning and therefore they add context, and so they help you understand the sentence better. So I think you should start learning kanji as soon as possible. So there used to be a great app for learning kanji, and I made a video about that app. However, I think something is going on with that app, or something happened with the developer or something. But my point is that you have to find a way to actively learn kanji, which you can do through an app. But recently I discovered another app, which is a website called Wanikani. It's pretty popular, I think, and I'm doing that currently every day. I'm trying to make a video about that too, so if that video is done, then I'll post it here as well. So my recommendations for vocabulary are, first of all, a reader, a graded reader, or any book that can help you learn vocab, then something that can help you learn kanji actively, then something like Wanikani, and a dictionary. Since context is so important when learning vocabulary especially, I think you can use something like Netflix or anime to help you learn vocabulary. Because if you use these platforms, they tell a story, and stories are just a great way to make connections and to remember vocabulary. And so with subtitles, it is pretty doable because you can instantly see, okay, this means this and that means that. But if you don't have subtitles, then it is really difficult, and you're going to find yourself pausing a lot of times and then having to look something up, and which you will forget anyway, and that's fine. But I think it's really annoying if you don't have subtitles, so make sure that you have something with subtitles. I'm watching this anime without any subtitles, and it is quite an experience. I'm making a video about that too. So if that video is done, then I'll post it here and you can watch that too if you want. First of all, you need something to actively learn grammar, fun, not boring, relevant to you, and it should be easy to understand. Then as you start introducing new things to your brain, just make sure that you expose yourself to enough Japanese so that you can hear these patterns and start getting used to them and actually learn them and remember them. Personally, I recommend using YouTube or video formats for this because it is just way more fun and effective. And in order to really start understanding different topics, you need to have a large range of vocabulary. And the best way to gain vocabulary is simply by reading. So start reading. And therefore you need to know some kanji as well. So start learning kanji and start reading as soon as possible. For this, I recommend graded readers, of course, or anything that tells a story, because stories help remember words more easily, because you can make connections and you can understand the sentences. So things like an anime or a series or Netflix or whatever. And then as your grammar improves, you can start to understand more complex sentences, and then as your vocabulary grows, you can start to understand more different topics. But the most important thing is that you put enough time into this. It doesn't matter what you do. I think if you just choose one resource in every category, that is totally fine when it works for you, but you have to do it consistently and daily. For example, if you start learning kanji today and you would learn kanji every day for maybe 1 hour, up to 1 hour a day, you can learn over 2000 kanji and 6000 vocabulary. And why those numbers? Well, that's the promise that Wanikani promises to its users. And here's a really interesting chart where you can see the amount of things that you learn through this app. So don't focus on how or what, just take one resource in every category and do this consistently. And if you do that, then there's no way that you are not going to progress. So good luck.